Welcome back. I think it's time for us to figure out what is happening here underneath the hood. You see, I haven't told you the full truth. This diagram here of our JavaScript runtime that you'll see on the web all over the place actually has a missing piece. And it's missing because, well, this is how it was originally like. But as of ES6, with the new updates in JavaScript, came another piece of the JavaScript runtime that often doesn't get mentioned in older resources. You see, promises are new to JavaScript, or they were added quite recently. And to accommodate this new addition, we had to change the event loop. You see, the event loop had what we called the callback queue, which we've talked about. And the callback queue, it was also called the task queue. But with promises, we had this thing natively in JavaScript now. Instead of just using callbacks, we now had a native way to handle asynchronous code using promises. So it wasn't really part of the web API. It's part of JavaScript, right? ECMAScript, the JavaScript committee, said, well, we need another queue for our promises. And to accommodate this addition, they said that, well, we need another queue called the job queue. Or, as some other people might call it, the micro task queue. And this queue is similar to the task queue or the callback queue, just a little smaller, but has a higher priority than this queue. You see, it means that the event loop is going to check the job queue first and make sure that there's nothing in that queue before it starts looking at the callback queue or the task queue. So that this has higher priority than this one. So that our diagram of the JavaScript runtime looks something like this now. We have a new addition of the job queue. And this job queue is now, just like the callback queue, in our JavaScript runtime, implemented by the browser. But the event loop is going to check the job queue first, make sure that that's empty before we start putting some of the callback queue functions onto the call stack. So now our code should make sense, right? Because we first run our program, we call set timeout, which, as it turns out, is something called a facade function. Because it isn't actually JavaScript. It just looks like JavaScript, but underneath the hood, it's a web API that calls the timer API to run for 0 seconds. And then we get to set timeout, which again calls the web API, and it's a facade function that triggers the timer in the browser to run for 10 milliseconds. And as those things are being processed, we go to the next line, promise.resolve. It says, oh, that is for the job queue. It's a promise. So we're going to send it to the job queue. And when it resolves, which in this case is right away, we're going to say, hey, it's going to resolve. And once it's resolved, I want you to console log this part. So now these three are outside of our world. And we get to console log. And console log says 3 is a crowd. So this gets logs first because it's not asynchronous. And then the event loop says, well, the job queue and the microtask queue, that has priority. So I'm not even going to bother checking the callback queue first. I'm going to check the job queue. Hey, job queue, do you have anything for me? And the job queue is going to say, well, yes, actually, I haven't waited that long at all. I've been waiting for you. Here's some console log for you. So we log this out. And you see here in this case, the JavaScript file hasn't even returned yet, and it's already checking the job queue for us, which is again because it has a higher priority. And then once the job queue is cleared, the event loop is going to say, all right, any more on the job queue? Nope, nothing else. All right, I'm going to start going to set timeout. Hey, the first set timeout. Are you done with your work? Yep, I'm done. Here, 1 is the loneliest number. You can log that. And then it checks the next one. Hey, are you done with this? Yep, 2 can be as bad as 1. You can log that too. So you see, because of this new job queue, even though set timeout was before the promise.then, and it should normally log this before the promise, the job queue gets checked first because it has higher priority. Now, I know this is a little bit confusing because the naming is a little bit confusing, right? And because we have so many names for these queue, there's often a lot of confusion around it. But the ECMAScript standard states that these are microtasks or jobs, which is where the name comes from, while all the other things are, like we've had before, callback queue and task queue. Now, the interesting thing with this implementation is that it's implemented by the browser, right? And we have different browsers. And although the implementation is quite standard across all browsers now, you'll still get some few weird kinks because browsers implement this differently, where this might not work as you expect. For example, some legacy browsers might not even have the job queue and might just have the callback queue. So that's something that you don't want to rely too heavily on, but you do want to be aware that as time progresses, we will have these 2 queues to look out for. All right, the mystery is solved. I hope now you can explain to somebody, hey, the JavaScript runtime, well, we actually have a job queue. Don't forget about it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.